Kyle. Thanks so much for hosting us today, and I appreciate everyone being with us. My name's Rob Gunning. I'm a panelist with the Accord ADR Group, and I also serve as an attorney with the law firm of Maxfield Gunning. And I'll turn it over to Doug for his introduction.
Hi, everybody. Doug McQuiston. I'm a mediator, panelist also with Accord ADR Group here in Boulder. I'm actually the southern wing practicing out of Metro Denver area. And prior to being a mediator and joining Steve in 2018, I was primarily a trial lawyer on the defense side for the better part of 38 years, doing all kinds of civil trials and appeals.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Before we get started, I want to give a disclaimer that I am by nature technologically challenged. So I say that for two reasons. One, if you have any technical questions, I'm going to let Doug handle those. He is much savvier than I am when it comes to technology. And then second, when I told my family that I was going to be doing a CLE with some technological component, my kids especially were rather concerned. But I say that because I've had a great experience doing video conference mediations, and if I can do it, anybody can do this successfully. It's quite easy to use, and we'll go through some of the practical tips in today's session. In terms of what we do, we mediate mostly civil litigation cases that are already in litigation. So at the Accord ADR Group, we typically handle mediations through the party caucus format, where we will break people out into separate breakout rooms. So I'll describe that a little bit. But I understand from the participant list that there's quite a few mediators here today who don't handle mediations in that format, might be doing more joint sessions, and also attorneys. So we're going to be talking about different models and how the video conference formatting might play into that. So in terms of the online and the video conference mediations, first want to start with what many people are well aware of, that it's widespread use right now. And of course, with the pandemic still going on, few, if any, mediations are being conducted in person. And that's, of course, been the case since about March of this year. With the statewide mask order in place, any in-person mediations require participation of people wearing face coverings. And we anticipate that video conference mediations are going to continue to be the prevalent model here for the foreseeable future. And we've had good success using those at the Accord ADR Group for the last few months. There's several online platforms that are available for video conference mediation. And Doug, if you want to put up the next slide here.
We'll do that. There we are.
And these are just, there isn't an exclusive list, but we have Zoom, which is the format that the Boulder County Bar Association is using for this CLE, WebEx, which is the what the state courts are using for court hearings. Microsoft Teams is another option, as is Google Hangouts. For mediation purposes, by far the most prevalent online platform has been Zoom, and that's the platform that we use at the Accord ADR Group. There's been an exponential increase in the use of Zoom. In December of 2019, as I understand it, Zoom had about 10 million monthly active users. That number jumped to about 200 to 300 million users this spring. For mediations, Zoom has a key breakout room feature, and it was also the platform of choice for online mediation before the pandemic. And then we have actually a little known fact about Zoom. It's actually been around for 51 years, predating the internet. Here are the pioneers of Zoom from 1969, the Brady Bunch, and Alice served as the first Zoom host. So little known fact, people know.
If any of you have participated in Zoom conferences or Zoom Hangouts with lots of people, you'll know what we mean. And for those of you who may not have been around when this series first aired, it has endless life, I think, on Nickelodeon. But this is what every time we have a Zoom conference, this is kind of what I feel like. It feels like the Brady Bunch or Hollywood Squares.
Exactly. As I mentioned, we have strong prospects for long-term use with unfortunately no end in sight to the pandemic. We anticipate that online mediations are going to be the predominant model, at least into early next year. And beyond the pandemic, we believe that video conference mediations are going to play a much larger role than they did before COVID-19 era. And be curious as to what participants think. And at any time during the CLE today, if you want to ask a question, as Kyle mentioned, please feel free to put that in the chat, or if you want to comment on that. And if anyone is just joining us late, everyone is muted here, and we are going to be taking questions through the chat feature. And so you can go to the chat bar at the bottom and send in a question, and we'll either get to that as we go through the presentation, or we can pick those up at the end if there's a few minutes to do that, which hopefully there will be. And in terms of the long-term prospects for video conference mediation, for one, they've become the norm right now, and that's probably going to enhance their legitimacy going forward. And there's certain advantages, as we've learned, to video conference mediations over in-person mediations. And we have up here on the screen this list of advantages that we've seen, or at least potentially can occur for video conference mediation. One is, of course, decreased travel time for both attorneys and for party representatives. For instance, if you have a half-day mediation and before you were driving down to, let's say, the tech center for the mediation, and you're coming from Boulder, there's a good 2 hours with in-person, or excuse me, with video conference mediation. That time is not incurred. And so there's decreased travel time, and particularly for shorter mediations, whether they're 2-hour mediations or half-day mediations, that can be a very, very big benefit.
Also a benefit for those who are mediators out there that if parties wish to have half-day mediations on the same day, before we did this by video, that was extremely hard to do. You have a mediation that goes for the morning, you know, you need a little bit extra time, but you have to have a hard stop to get to your next one and have an hour of travel time. This way we cut out the travel time. It makes it easier to schedule 2, 3, depending on the length of your mediations in one day, because there's no travel time incurred.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then in terms of other travel-related benefits, permits participation by out-of-state participants. We've seen that's been particularly helpful in cases where there's insurance coverage and you might have an adjuster that's housed out of state. They can easily participate throughout the mediation as opposed to solely being available by phone. And so there is a significant advantage there. Also safety, particularly for some domestic relations mediations or any mediation where there's significant strife between the parties. The fact that these are being conducted online can enhance safety, and that might be a big benefit going forward, and that's something people can consider. And for better or worse, I think there is an efficiency and there's some multitasking abilities. Oftentimes, especially in the caucus format that we use, if we're visiting with the other party for up to an hour or so, there's potentially some downtime, and having a video conference mediation may allow both attorneys and parties to focus on other matters, at least for a brief amount of time. Now that can of course happen in an in-person mediation as well, but I think this format allows for that perhaps a little bit more. I've wondered in some mediations whether it might actually decrease the likelihood that attorneys and parties might be wanting to walk out of the mediation if they feel it's not going as they anticipated, or if it's not working. If it's an online platform and it's less intrusive onto someone's schedule, maybe they're going to stick around a little bit longer. Don't have any data for that, but just something to consider. Next, follow-up sessions. If you have a mediation and don't quite get it resolved, but close, and it may this format lends itself well to set up a follow-up session for the next day or for the next week, follow up with counsel for an hour or two, and it's a great format for that. And I could see where that's going to be a prevalent model when we get back to in-person mediations. You could have an in-person mediation and then, of course, follow it up with a online mediation the following week if need be, to try to be more efficient. We have a reach around the world. It allows mediators to conduct mediations literally anywhere in the world, and for parties to participate from anywhere in the United States or around the world.
One cautionary note on that for mediators, it's something to keep in mind that different states and even different areas of the world, different countries have their own rules about whether mediating in that country or in that state is something that an out-of-state mediator can do. So if you do plan to develop more of a global or national approach, be sure that you're checking each of the states where you'll be doing these to make sure that there's no registration or other requirement for mediators to practice in that state. Usually not, but there are a few out there that have some peculiar rules.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. That's a great point. And then we also have here balancing work and home needs. Participants can easily, of course, participate by home and better balance family and other work needs that they might have. And for parties who are new to mediation, it may be less intimidating than in-person mediation. If somebody's participating from their home, they may feel more comfortable. So that's another advantage. And then lastly, we don't have it on here, but cost of footwear is decreasing, as it doesn't really matter what you wear, be on your feet, and so perhaps less need for dress shoes as we go forward. So then there are, of course, disadvantages to video conference mediation over in person, and the real, what I see is the biggest is the loss of face-to-face communication, and we can do that a little bit through Zoom or through other online platforms, but I think there's a lot that's lost when you can't see somebody, especially if you don't know them previously. And for attorneys and parties, the mediator connection, I think it can make it more difficult for mediators to build trust with both the parties and the attorneys. And so that's, I think, certainly a significant drawback with video conference mediations. In conjunction with that, it's more difficult to read body language. You could kind of read somebody's language, and we'll talk a little bit later about putting people on a speaker versus gallery view. So that's something you could do to try to make somebody's image a little bit larger, but it certainly can be more challenging to see how somebody is taking the news of the mediation or what their perception is of something that you've said. It can make interruptions more likely, and this is particularly for mediators who have joint sessions that predominate when everybody is in the same virtual room. In my experience, people are more likely to interrupt when we have an online platform versus if everybody's in person. And so one thing to do is at the outset remind people that we need to have one person talk at a time. It's also without the body language, you don't know when somebody else might be done. And even if someone's not trying to interrupt someone else, interruptions can just be more likely. So that's something to be aware of. Next, document sharing, and we'll get to that as to how best to share documents. As you see here, Doug is sharing this PowerPoint presentation through the screen share feature, and you can share documents, and we'll get into that, but it can certainly be more cumbersome than if everybody's in person and you simply presented a document to them, or they want you to take a look at the document as the mediator. Having to do it online is certainly more cumbersome, but it can be done.
Actually, I'm going to give Rob full credit for the PowerPoint. He uses false modesty sometimes about his technological abilities. It's a great presentation, and he's the guy that came up with it. One of the things, Rob, I'll toss out there is it's kind of intertwined with what we're going to talk about in a minute with connection and stability. Sharing the screen definitely increases the bandwidth that Zoom requires. So if you have issues with your connection as the person sharing the screen, it can complicate the rest of what's going on the screen and even lead to an interruption in the process. So it's something to be kept in mind as you share screen to look at a document or whatever. It goes kind of hand in hand with having a high quality connection to make sure that you've done everything you can to have good bandwidth, because it does boost the requirement of bandwidth as you share screens or do other things like that. Video, especially if you're sharing a video online, you're streaming, you're actually doing lots of things demanding a lot of power from the computer.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to the next disadvantage, where we have just, you know, inherent with an online platform is you have connection and technology issues, and we'll get into some hardware recommendations to decrease the likelihood of that, but it's just inherent in this process. And fortunately, it doesn't happen too much, but there are occasionally losses of the connection, and either someone's frozen for a while, sometimes people drop off the mediation, and of course you don't have that with an in-person mediation. And so these connectivity issues can be a real disadvantage to the video conference mediations, but there are some real concrete things you can do to reduce the likelihood that that's going to happen. And the last one we have here is that, especially for people who are new to mediation, perhaps it seems a little bit less serious. Perhaps participants may not be as motivated to reach a resolution if it's not an in-person mediation. It's hard to say, but certainly the informality, which might make it easier for new participants, conversely, they may not take it quite as seriously as if we had an in-person mediation. And before we get to the hardware, I just wanted to also address another potential disadvantage. There's a new term in our world today called Zoom fatigue, and it's a real thing. And higher levels of concentration are required when somebody is staring at a computer screen all day, especially seeing multiple images. It can lead to eye strain. So that can be a disadvantage, especially in a long mediation. And one thing that mediators may want to consider is whether to have shorter staggered sessions instead of one long session, depending on scheduling. I think that makes it be difficult unless everybody's schedules line up to just have one session one day and then another session the next. But to the extent you can do that, one day you could have perhaps one day with staggered sessions. If you have two parties, you could have 1 hour with one party, another hour with the other party, and then the next day have a joint session or separate caucuses with those parties, and the mediation sessions would be shorter. That may diminish Zoom fatigue, but of course there's some real scheduling issues that go along with that.
I think staggered starts can help if you anticipate, because of the issues in your mediation, that you're going to be using caucus systems and putting people in different rooms. And you expect, say, for example, you're going to be speaking with a plaintiff or petitioner for quite a bit of time in the morning. You know, I think it would help in certain circumstances to stagger the starts, ask the plaintiff to log on at 9, defense at 9:30, something like that can help. As Rob pointed out, though, I don't know that staggering by day or holding multiple short sessions is going to catch on because of scheduling concerns lawyers have. Lawyers and parties have a lot going on, and it can be challenging to get those dates lined up. So most of our parties, we've been finding out, really just appreciate to power through one mediation at a time and just get it all done in a half day or a full day. So we've found that's fairly popular. But staggered starts is something I think worth a try.
Okay, and Doug, could you put up the next screen with the hardware?
Yep. And while we're talking about Zoom fatigue, I think some of the things we try to do as mediators during the initial moments of the mediation is remind people that staring into the computer can be tiring, that they should take time while we're caucusing with different parties to get up, move around, look at something else, get a drink of water, get a sandwich, do the kinds of things you would need to do to keep yourself from getting too fatigued. And that does help by reminding folks to get up and move around and stretch. And it's just important for the mediators too. I always try when I'm moving from room to room to take the time to actually get up and move around a bit, as I would if I was walking from room to room in a conference room. It's amazing how that little step can help keep you going for a full day mediation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely critical to do that, both for, as Doug mentioned, for participants and for mediators. And it's easier for the participants if you have the caucus format. There's going to be that time, and you can easily get up. And for quite a while, for the mediator, it can be a real challenge because there's that. Always feel that pressure. I want to go to the next room. I want to be very efficient. I don't want to lose time. But as the mediator, you got to also, look after yourself and make sure that you take, even if it's 1-2 minutes, just to get up and move around, and you're going to be that much more effective, especially towards the end of a long day. So next we want to talk about some technology issues here, and we're going to start with the hardware. And you don't need anything really fancy. You don't need an expensive setup. We recommend having a newer laptop, whatever that might mean, but or an iPad with a camera and a microphone. So most laptops that have come out the last few years work really well. And in our experience, this is really the preferred hardware for participants in a mediation. And it usually works fine. For this presentation, I'm using the microphone on my laptop along with the camera. I don't have any special equipment, and it tends to work fairly well. Smartphones can work in a pinch. They're not ideal, but I've had a few mediations where participants, parties especially, are using a phone. It does allow the video in addition to the audio. But one thing with the smartphone is that try not to, if you are using one, avoid walking around with the device. It can be really jarring to watch somebody moving around all day, and it's much more likely if someone's using a smartphone than if they're using a laptop for that. If you do use a smartphone, you think about using the Wi-Fi connection and putting it on that setting instead of your cellular phone. You'll have a much more stable connection, and that's really critical. So if you're going to be participating by phone, please do that. I really recommend avoid using a desktop computer. If you do, make sure you plan ahead and that there's an audio that comes out. I had a mediation recently where this was an issue for the participants where there were 2 people in the room, and there's the jack for the audio, but they had to configure an external audio device to be able to get it to play. So if you're using a desktop, please make sure that it has a camera with it, and also that the audio is going to be enabled so that you can use that for either a mediation or if you're participating as a mediator or as an attorney. Next, lighting in front's preferred. So if you have a light that you can set up in back of your computer, that typically works a little bit better. If there's a bright light in back of you, that can be harder to see. So I'm here in my office, and I'm actually not at my desk. I'm at a little table because I'm away from the windows. The lighting's much better. If I move my computer here, you can see where that window, that light coming in there, someone having to look at that all day, it would make it a little bit more difficult. So especially as a mediator, give some thought to having the light source in front as opposed to in back of you. And then you could consider, especially if you're going to be doing many mediations through video conference, considering external microphones or headphones. And also there's, and Doug's going to talk about this, there's hardware you can purchase or even software that can help you have a stable Wi-Fi connection. So I'll turn this piece over to Doug.
Yeah, a lot depends on how you're lit in the room that you're going to be doing these. I'd like to say that this is my palatial home office with loads of books and comfortable leather chairs behind me, but as you can probably gather, it's actually a Zoom background that I've sort of customized and added our logo onto. And the reason for that is the room I'm doing this in, the lighting would not be ideal, and it's just an office with walls. So rather than that, I used a background like this. But because of the lighting in the room, I think this is especially true for mediators. You're going to be moderating the all-day process. You're kind of in charge of the show. You want to make sure you do everything you can to assure a high-quality image and audio so that parties don't have to struggle to hear or see you. So as Rob pointed out, I've used, as this has gone along, I started with my laptop camera, which was 780p in resolution, and that microphone. People were indicating they were having a hard time hearing me because my screen was maybe 20 inches away from my face. So I invested in a microphone that's on a boom, and I used that as the audio, as my means of speaking. And in order to smooth out the image, I've invested in the 1080p cameras you can buy now are very much less expensive than they were 5 or 6 years ago. It's an ultra high definition camera. I can focus it if I need to manually, carries a high definition image. It's also easier on the packet transmission data wise because it transmits a denser package of data as I'm talking. So it has it's easier to look at, I hope. I'm not that much easier to look at, but the camera makes it easier to look at me. And to even out the lighting in the room, you might want to look into video podcast lighting. Again, that's not very expensive. This is an Amazon purchase. I've got 2 lights. They're LED, use very little electricity. They're dimmable, or I can make them bright or dim as I need to customize the lighting so that I'm not washed out, but I'm not too dark. And there's no shadows. That also helps, smooth out the image and lets people see and hear you more clearly. There's only so much I can do about how I look, but at the same time, it does help to have a clear image. As far as the connections, this is something we've learned through bitter experience ourselves. My home setup, my office is upstairs from my modem. So the actual cable modem I use is a good 30 feet away from where I'm sitting, interrupted by walls. So I was having a hard time with the connection, even though it's a good solid Wi-Fi connection with plenty of speed. I look at the speed test and I've got loads of speed. But what is the driver here is something called packet loss. I'm not going to get into that in any detail, but what it basically means is Zoom likes a good stable connection. And if during the connection your Wi-Fi blips a little bit, somebody else logs on, or you've got somebody else trying to do a Zoom conference and there's competition for that pipe, you can have what's called packet loss, where a bit of data will get dropped. Zoom doesn't like that, and it'll kick you off. So what we've learned is, what I've managed to do, you don't need to worry about setting up a whole costly home Wi-Fi or home LAN connection, wired connections. There's a system out there called TP-Link Powerline. Here it is. I can show it to you without it disappearing. It's relatively inexpensive. It works to set up a hardwired connection through your home electrical system, believe it or not, and it works fantastically. It'll stabilize the connection. Doesn't make it any faster, it just makes it more stable. So when you think about it, now that we're all working at home, the kids are going to school at home, you might have 4 or 5 or more Zoom conferences going on at the same time, or other WebEx meetings, et cetera. Your family's using much more bandwidth than they did before. If everybody's on Wi-Fi, that can lead to a jittery connection. If you want to stabilize it, TP-Link's an inexpensive way to do it. That way, everybody that wants a wired connection, just plug in one of the devices. You can buy as many of the devices as you want, and then use a LAN cable to connect to your computer. The other thing I use that also stabilizes and smooths out the connection a bit is a thing that you can look online. It's called Speedify.com. Speedify is the name of the software. Basically sets up a secure VPN. So it takes advantage of looking around for the most solid data connections you can find, and then it'll log you through that data connection. That's done a lot to smooth the connection out. But it's just, you don't need to become a computer expert about it, but it does help to pay attention to these things because it smooths out what we're trying to do. The TP-Link TP's been around a long time. They make modems, they make all kinds of equipment like that and peripherals. You can find these online, TP-Link.com, or Powerline is the name of the product. Speedify.com if you take a look at it. If you don't have any problems with your connection and it works fine, then I wouldn't change a thing. But if you're having issues with it, it's getting a little janky from time to time, you have trouble with lots of people logging on, it's something to look into. As far as the lighting goes, the lighting I use is about 20 inches away from my face. I have it on either side of me so there's no shadow. Just keep in mind that you're actually staging yourself for these. Much as we don't really want to be TV stars at the same time, the reason they use lighting on television is because it makes it easier to watch. So that's what you're trying to do. Lots of people have used external microphones, headphones. You'll see a lot of people using the Apple AirPod or AirPod Pros earpieces. Those work pretty well. And anything you need to do to maintain a good solid audio connection and your own audio going out and your own video connection. So that's what we're looking for. You don't need to get too bogged down in the hardware, but it does pay to pay a little bit of attention to your hardware. Where's your camera? How far away is it from you? Mine's about 13, 14 inches from my face right now. That produces the best image. So a little bit of mindfulness goes a long way.
Thanks, Doug. I'm glad you were able to address that. Doug's fantastic. And anytime I have a technology question, I ask him. He's fantastic on these issues. So that's great information. We're past 12:30 here, so I want to move on to the software side of things, or at least the online platform, and we'll go to the Zoom platform features. And again, we're focusing on Zoom as that's the predominant platform that's being used right now. But of course, there are other platforms that can be used. Doug, can you put the next one up here? So there are, first thing to keep in mind as a mediator is that there are some security features, and as probably everyone heard a few months ago, there were issues in the media about whether Zoom is secure, and for mediations, that's of course critical. So we looked into that extensively, and Zoom immediately took some action. The main issue that had come about was when particularly public organizations were sending out or posting on their website a link to the meeting, which would enable anyone to Zoom bomb and just jump into the meeting. And so as a mediator, you want to be careful about once you set up the meeting in Zoom, to send the link only to the participants. You could send it if there's attorneys and parties, you could send it to the attorneys and then ask them to send it to their clients or to any of the other participants in the mediation. And with that link, only those people who receive the link have the ability to log on. There's also in the personal settings, when you log on to Zoom, you can enable certain additional protections. You can have someone actually input a password, but again, with the link, only those people who receive the link can log in, but there are extra protections you can enable. And then also enabling the waiting room is a key feature as well, and you can do that in your settings. And that way, when you start the meeting, you have to personally admit everybody in. You can ensure that the participants that are there are supposed to be there. And keep in mind, if somebody drops off because of a connection issue, you'll have to look for them in the participants. You can go down to the participants tab, which we'll get to in a minute, and have them readmit it from the waiting room. But that also ensures that if someone somehow did get access, that they can't Zoom bomb your mediation.
Robert, let me jump in. There was a question about confidentiality in Zoom mediations. It's not really software-based, it's human software-based. And we've all encountered this. The example is a mediation where it became clear that somebody at some point was in the room with one of the parties that we didn't know about, or that a mediator may not know who that is. So how do you deal with that? The way we try to deal with it is in the preliminary discussions, we ask the parties to make sure they're in a private room, that others aren't around within earshot, if at all possible. You have to be somewhat flexible on that because, you know, sometimes people's home environment may be such that they don't have a room where they can go be by themselves. But we ask them to make sure that they are, to the extent they can be, by themselves, that other people who aren't connected to the case don't participate or aren't available to hear what's going on unless we know who they are and we identify that they're there. I think, for example, sometimes a party might want a spouse or a relative or some other person to be there with them. That's fine, as long as we know who they are, because the process itself is confidential. Remember, in a 3D mediation where we're in a conference room, we can see who's there, and people who aren't supposed to be there aren't there. It's a little harder to police when you're online. So what we try to do is do the policing ourselves. When people log into a meeting, we make sure we identify who everyone is and who they're with or representing, so that if a party wishes to have a relative from out of town log on, we know that and the parties all agree to that. If someone is in the room, we ask them to identify themselves and remind them that they're bound by the same confidentiality as if they were a party. And then sometimes to deal with that confidentiality issue, if you aren't caucusing and a party has a non-party present with them, you might consider caucusing that room off. Just set up a conference room for them separately so that they're not hearing anything from the other participants that they shouldn't be hearing.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And to enable that too, when we get to the breakout room feature here in just a minute, it does allow you to set up additional breakout rooms. So even if you have somebody that you didn't anticipate, or you have the need to separate out a party group for whatever reason, you can do that and then set up a separate room and make sure you're only talking to the individuals you want to have involved in that communication. So other features here, we'll have the breakout rooms. In the lower, if you're on your Zoom screen right now, just wanted to point out a few things, and many of you are probably well aware of these, but in the lower left-hand corner for the audio, you can, of course, mute and unmute there. There's also the arrow there. You can see audio settings and go into there if you want to check that out. For the video, that can, it's for enabling video. And there's also, when you have a professional version of Zoom, you can choose different virtual backgrounds. So as Doug has done here, and even you can change during the mediation if you want to. So I can go from being in my office to on top of a 14er here. I really like this one. Or you can go to Hawaii, back to Boulder, and then back to the office. And so those are some nice features if you're going to be doing many mediations or even meetings, to have those virtual backgrounds. And you can have pictures on your laptop that you can download and create your own background if you'd like. And there's also many available online. On the participants feature, when you go there, you can see a list of all the participants. That also shows you whether they're muted or whether their video is enabled. That can be helpful when you're having people join to make sure that their video and audio is enabled. We have the chat feature here, which some people have used. Again, feel free to send any questions via the chat. One thing I'll keep in mind is that you'll see here on the, if you click on the chat to the, there's a box here that says to, and it can be to everyone, or depending on the version that's being used, there may be the ability to chat with particular participants, but please be careful about using that, because you know, just like emails, you may want to assume that your chat's going to everybody. So be well aware of that, but that's a nice feature to use. And we'll get to the share screen here in just a moment, but let's go to the screen here. We have breakout rooms, and we don't have the breakout room feature. You don't have this feature if you don't have the professional version of Zoom. It costs only about $15 or $16 a month. So if you're going to be mediating cases, strongly recommend that you get that to have this feature if you do want to set up the party caucus feature. And you can set it up right before the mediation begins. So if you log on about 15 minutes before your mediation, you can create the breakout rooms. It's very easy to do that. And then also you can name the rooms, which I find very helpful, particularly if you have a multi-party mediation. And you're trying to remember where people are. If you name the room based on the party name, that's a lot easier than breakout room 1, 2, 3, or 4. So you can go ahead and name those ahead of time. And then, as I had mentioned, you can also create new rooms if you need to during the mediation.
Another feature we were talking about naming, Rob, is if you have a party dialing in and their name doesn't show up, if they're using, say, a cell phone connection or something, and you get a random, just a telephone number, obviously you want to identify who that party is, but Zoom allows you as the moderator, if you're the one doing the mediation, to rename that connection. So whereas their cell phone number or something might show up, you can actually replace that with their name so that you and the other parties know who that is. And that's very helpful to do, to make sure you know who's who and you're parking people in the correct rooms and you're not making a mistake there. And the conference room feature is very simple. It works essentially as if we were in a big place with lots of conference rooms. The moderator, as Rob mentioned, creates the room. It might be plaintiff, defendant Smith, defendant Jones, however many parties you have. And then how you get into them, the question is, how do you get to a chat room? How do you get to the breakout room? It's very simple. The moderator assigns people to the rooms. So as we've identified everybody, by name and by who they are and who they represent, we then just assign the rooms. So plaintiff and their counsel would be assigned to the plaintiff room, petitioner, respondent, that sort of thing. And you just assign them. And once the moderator opens the room, each participant gets a notification saying you've been invited to go to, the defense conference room or the plaintiff conference room. And you click on that and in you are. And you're there until the moderator decides to move you someplace else, or close the rooms altogether. So the moderator is the one that places people in their room, just like it would be in a regular conference room. You'd have a receptionist show you to where your room is, and you'd be expected to remain in that room for the whole time.
Thanks, Doug. And anyone that wants additional information about breakout rooms, if you haven't used those before, in the chat box here, I've pasted up above here there's a Zoom tutorial. So if you go into Zoom under resources, there's a video tutorial tab, and one of those is breakout rooms. It's about a 3-minute video you can watch, and that walks you through step by step as to how to do it. Also, if anyone's interested in just seeing this, we don't have the ability here with in this presentation or the time, but I've set up a separate breakout room meeting at 1 o'clock today, and I've put in the link. And anyone that wants to see the breakout room feature, feel free at 1 o'clock, or we'll probably go just a few minutes beyond that, and click on that link, and we'll set up breakout rooms, and we can show that feature as well after this CLE. So certainly no need to do that, but if you do have interest and not quite sure how to do that, we're happy to walk people through the breakout room feature. Let's see, going then to the bottom of the screen here, we do have the share screen feature. And one thing you're going to want to keep in mind as a mediator is that if you do want participants to be able to share documents, you need to enable that. And you can either do that in your settings. Also, when you're serving as the host, there's a button you can click on the share screen that has an advanced option, and you can change who has the ability to share a screen. And so make sure if you do want participants to be able to share documents with you, that they have the ability to do that. And then when this is enabled, everyone in the mediation is going to be able to see what you have on your screen. It works particularly well for settlement memorandums of understanding at the end of a mediation. And so that button here is right on the in the middle. We also have a record button, which if you don't want to use, obviously, in a mediation, since they're confidential. One thing to keep in mind if you're a mediator and you're sending out invitations, I think the default in Zoom is that participants cannot record, which is what you want to make sure. You could enable people to record it, so just be absolutely certain that in your settings you don't allow people to record the mediation. Also, you can see here on this presentation in the upper left-hand corner, it states recording. So if somebody is recording it, you'll be able to see that as well. So just be aware of that if you're serving as a mediator. And then lastly, here we have a reactions tab. I don't find this particularly helpful, but I suppose for some meetings it might be a nice feature, but typically don't use that in a mediation. A few other things I wanted to point out in the upper parts of the screen here. We've already shown the recording. There's also the icon here with the green badge, if you will, with the check mark. It shows you're using enhanced encryption. That goes to the security features. And then there's an information button if you need help. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a speaker versus gallery view. And this can be nice if you want to be able to look at everybody at the same time. You'll have it on the gallery view, kind of the Brady Bunch example that we showed at the beginning. Or if you want to have it in speaker view, you can enable that. And then there's also the full versus the partial screen feature in the far upper right-hand corner.
one feature, as we were talking about earlier, on like for this environment here, we're all muted. If there was some reason that you wanted to speak, one quick way to do that without unmuting and muting yourself is just hit the space bar. If you're on mute, you can hit the space bar and that will unmute you for the duration of when you're talking. Think of it like a ham radio microphone. When you're holding down the space bar, you can speak, and then when you let it go, it goes back to mute. It's a kind of a handy trick. But at the same time, if we're in separate conference rooms, we talked about, people in that room can hear each other, but no one else can hear you. It's the same as any other conference room, so that's why that's a handy feature. But keep in mind that you can only be heard or seen in that room, and you can only send chats to people in that room. You can't send chats in between rooms, and that's an obvious security feature as well.
Okay. Thanks, Doug.
Yep.
And before we move on from Zoom, and I know we're getting close to the end here, so I want to move along, but just wanted to mention a really handy feature that Doug actually clued me into. There is and perhaps Doug, you could explain exactly where this is, but in the Zoom settings, there's the statistics feature, and there you can actually see what your audio and video metrics are. And so the packet loss that Doug talked about before, you can go into that, see your statistics, and you can see how strong your connection is, whether you're at home or in the office. And that can be a really useful diagnostic tool for you to determine whether you need to go out and perhaps buy some of the hardware that Doug had mentioned previously. And it looks like he's showing us right here.
Yeah, if you can see it, I don't know if you can see the screen. You see down here on the left side, you'll see all the different audio video settings. These are also useful to log in a couple minutes early, test your microphone, test your speaker, make sure you can hear and see everything. You can check your settings over here, enable stereo sound, that sort of thing. And then over here are the different buttons you can click on. Statistics, it gives you a look at how your overall usage is, how much CPU or core processing unit power you're using, what memory you're using. You can look at your audio settings, how that's doing as far as what they call latency, jitter, and packet loss. You can see we're doing very well on this because of my Speedify VPN and the wired connection. Same thing with video. This is a little bit in the weeds, but you want to make sure you've got adequate frames per second so that you're not too janky looking. Again, it can tell you how you're doing as far as the resolution, packet loss, that sort of thing. So it's kind of a handy glimpse at your power output, input, how you're doing on that. So that's, it's just a handy feature to look at, not necessarily during a proceeding, but a good thing to look at to make sure your connection's solid and your settings are the way you want them. You can check that anytime during the process as well.
Thanks, Doug. And can you go to the, I think our next one, I think we might be on to the practical tips.
Yep, there we go.
There we are. Okay. And I know we're at 12:50, and I want to allow some time if there's any additional questions. Again, feel free to use the chat feature and let us know if you have any questions. But a few additional issues, and we've touched on some of these already. One, and more of some of these are geared more for mediations in particular. The mediation agreement, of course, when we're in person, it's a lot easier, at least I find it's a lot easier to remember, hey, if you haven't already submitted your signed mediation agreement, can you please sign it now? And it's a little bit harder to remember that when you're doing a video conference mediation. So I often like to make sure I make a note to ask participants at the very beginning of the mediation, once they're broken out into the separate caucus rooms, if they haven't already signed that, please do so. You can also, of course, follow up the day before your mediation as well, if you want to just take care of it before the mediation, but something that you certainly want to be cognizant of and make sure that you're not forgetting to get a signed mediation agreement from all of the participants. Settlement statements really work the same way they always have, but I noted that we find as mediators they're particularly helpful to receive. Most attorneys will send those in ahead of time. It's not an absolute requirement, but it sure helps to have a mediation settlement statement. And they're strictly confidential, of course, and it can really be helpful to the mediator if you include in the settlement statement and you're candid about both the strengths and the weaknesses of the case. It can really help us prepare for the mediation, and they're just as important in a video conference mediation to receive ahead of time as they are for an in-person. The next item here is cell phone number exchange. This is a good idea before a video conference mediation. If you feel comfortable giving out your cell phone number, particularly if there's attorneys involved, it's helpful to have that for a couple reasons. One, if there is a glitch and somebody gets dropped off, it's easy for people to connect and communicate outside of the platform. Also, Zoom doesn't, as yet as I know, have a virtual knock feature. So if we're in an in-person mediation, you got the mediator knocking on your conference room door, you know that person's coming in. And if you're in an attorney-client communication, you know that the mediator is going to be joining. That feature isn't really readily available on Zoom. There is a brief moment where if somebody's looking at the screen, they'll see that. But if they're not looking at the screen, they may not know that you're coming into the room. And I have found that sometimes when I've done that, people might be talking about something that they may not want me to be privy to. So I always make sure I announce myself. So an alternative is to text the attorneys before you enter and just send a quick text to the attorney saying, knock, knock, or here, you know, I'm coming into the room. And that way they know that the mediator is going to be joining. Attire, a dress for success, you know, certainly at least from the waist up. It doesn't matter what kind of shoes you're wearing or whether you're wearing shoes or slippers for that matter. But certainly be aware that this is a professional environment, and I think it's been easier during this time for people to not dress as professionally as they may for an in-person, and to make sure that everyone's taking the process seriously, and that to show everybody that whether you're a mediator, whether you're an attorney, that you're invested in the process and that you recognize this is a professional setting. And we've seen a wide variety of fashion over the last few months. So just something to keep in mind is be mindful about how you look.
There's a new expression out there now that's entered the vernacular called Zoom professional, which is what Rob and I are doing. Coat and tie, anything below the waist is optional. Both of us, I assure you, are wearing pants, but they might be shorts, might be barefoot. It doesn't matter because all you're looking at is anchorman views. So, but it is important, and I think it helps the parties, especially if their lawyers are professionally dressed, creates confidence. It creates, you know, a sense of honor and trust in the proceedings. It does help. So we try to make a point of that as mediators, and I think as participants, it's good to pay a little bit of attention to how we're attired because it's a serious process that we're trying to have here.
Yeah. And we've already covered some of these other breaks. That's important both for participants, attorneys, clients, and the mediator. Don't forget to do that. We have confidentiality. That's a really important point, and Doug's spoken about that, where you want to initially make sure that everyone's well aware that no one else should be in earshot, and you want to be aware of that throughout the mediation, because of course that can change as the mediation progresses. And if as the mediator you think that there may be somebody else in the room, you really need to be asking the attorney or the party if somebody has joined, and just remind them of the confidentiality that goes along with this process. Not a requirement by any means, but mediators who do a significant number of video conference mediation may want to consider signing up with DocuSign. It makes signing a settlement memorandum at the end of the day much easier, particularly if somebody's not close to a scanner. I find that can be very easy, but you may have a party in particular that doesn't have a scanner, and they're not able to sign it right away. And DocuSign is very easy for people to use. And then, of course, as we also touched on the screen share enabling, make sure that anyone that you do want to have screen share, that's enabled so that they can share that with you. And that's another way to review a settlement memorandum of understanding at the end of the day. And that's at the end of our presentation, and if there are any additional questions here, we cut it just up to 3 minutes before, but please send us any questions that you have. And again, I've set up this breakout room meeting, and so you know, a few minutes, so maybe give us just a few minutes to get in, but I'll set up that meeting, and anyone that wants to join, happy to break out people into different breakout rooms just so you can see that feature if you haven't already had that experience in a mediation. Doug, you have anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I think, you touched out on DocuSign. I think it's handy for a lot of things. Having clients sign documents, things like that, it's extremely quick, foolproof. Just remember what we want to try to do with this is to let the technology fade into the background. What you really want to do is have an in-person experience. And the things we've talked about today are all designed to help that happen. Lighting, quality of video, quality of audio, solid connection. The more of the variables you can screen out like that, the more actually people can get into the process as though they're face to face. And we found that if you take away some of those interference issues, people really do invest in the process, and it is just about as good as being in person. Some cases you just need to be there, but most of the time it's a pretty efficient way to resolve disputes. People are enjoying the process more now as they get used to it. Remember, when we all first started this, very few people had done online dispute resolution. I had co-written an article about it that published in the February, believe it or not, 2020 Colorado Lawyer about online dispute resolution. It's kind of a novel new thing. Little did we know that we'd all be using it in a month. But it does work if you pay attention to the process a little bit ahead of time and use some of the tips we've talked about today. It really can fade into the background, and then you're just dealing with people face to face.
Yeah, thanks, Doug.
Any other questions? You can chat them, or you can hit the space bar and ask.
And if not, Neil, we can turn it over to see if Kyle is going to join us again here to conclude. And again, right after this session ends, I'll go ahead and set up that other meeting, and optional, of course, but anyone that wants to see that, we'll keep that open for 10, 15 minutes so we can move people around to different breakout rooms.
Great. So again, thank you to Rob and Doug. I will send out the CLE form to the attendee list here shortly, so you can see that this afternoon. And again, if you have any questions, you can email me and I can get it to Rob and Doug. I'll also be posting the recording of this on our YouTube channel, hopefully in the next day or two, in case there's any parts you missed. But otherwise, thank you all for joining us and have a great weekend.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.